May 22nd, 1942. 480 miles south of Benghazi, deep in the absolute desolation of the Libyan desert, Hauptmann Klaus Weber wiped the sand from his binoculars and studied the endless sea of dunes stretching to the horizon. The 39-year-old Wehrmacht logistics officer had been assured by Italian intelligence that nothing, absolutely nothing, could survive out here, let alone pose a military threat. The nearest British forces were over 300 miles north along the coast. Between Weber's supply convoy and any possible enemy lay the most inhospitable terrain on Earth. Temperatures that could reach 140 degrees Fahrenheit in the shade, if shade existed. No water, no vegetation, no landmarks. Just an infinite ocean of sand and rock that had defeated armies since the time of the Romans. Weber's convoy of 23 trucks carried critical supplies for Rommel's Afrika Corps, fuel, ammunition, spare parts desperately needed for the coming offensive at Gazala. The route through the deep desert was considered so safe that they travelled without fighter escort, with minimal guards, running with headlights on to make better time through the moonless night. The war, Weber had been told, was happening somewhere else. What Hauptmann Weber didn't know, what German intelligence had completely failed to discover, was that 40 men in 11 heavily modified Chevrolet trucks had been watching his convoy for the past 6 hours, tracking them from positions so distant that detection was impossible. These men had travelled over 500 miles from their secret base, crossing terrain that German experts had declared utterly impassable. They carried enough fuel, water and ammunition to survive for weeks in conditions that would kill ordinary soldiers in days. They moved through the desert like ghosts, leaving no tracks, making no sound, appearing from nowhere and vanishing back into the wasteland. The Germans called them Wüstenpiraten, desert pirates. The Italians had a more colourful term, Fantasmi del Deserto, ghosts of the desert, but their official designation was far more mundane, the Long-Range Desert Group. And by the time Weber realised they existed, it was already far too late. This is the story of how 25 men in battered trucks paralysed an entire army, how navigation by sun compass and theodolite proved more effective than overwhelming force, how the most inhospitable desert on Earth became Britain's secret weapon, and how German troops learned to fear empty horizons because death could be watching from 50 miles away with a pair of binoculars and a radio. The Long-Range Desert Group emerged from a desperate situation in June 1940. With France's fall, Italy's entry into the war, and British forces drastically outnumbered in North Africa, conventional military wisdom offered little hope. The Italian army in Libya numbered over 250,000 troops against roughly 36,000 British and Commonwealth soldiers in Egypt. The mathematics of conventional warfare pointed toward inevitable defeat. But Major Ralph Alger Banold had spent the previous decade ignoring conventional wisdom about what was possible in the desert. The 44-year-old Royal Signals officer was an unlikely candidate for military legend. Soft-spoken, scholarly, more comfortable with scientific instruments than soldiers, Bagnold had devoted his spare time in the 1920s and 1930s to exploring the Libyan desert. While other officers spent leaves in Cairo's clubs, Bagnold organised expeditions deep into the Sand Sea, the vast ocean of dunes west of the Nile that map simply labelled unexplored. His expeditions had pioneered techniques for long-range desert travel, sun compasses for navigation when landmarks didn't exist, theodolites for astronomical position fixing, specially modified vehicles with lowered tyre pressure, extra cooling, and condensers to reclaim radiator water. Steel channels carried on each vehicle to place under wheels stuck in soft sand. Navigation by dead reckoning across hundreds of miles with accuracy measured in single-digit miles. Most importantly, Bagnold had proved that the supposedly impassable Great Sand Sea could be crossed. His expedition in 1932 had travelled over 6,000 miles through terrain that defeated even the Bedouin. He had discovered that the desert, rather than being an impenetrable barrier, could become a highway for those who understood its rules. When war broke out, Banold was in England, but by June 1940, with the situation in North Africa deteriorating rapidly, he found himself summoned to General Archibald Wavell's headquarters in Cairo. Wavell, commanding British forces in the Middle East, was desperate for any advantage. Banold's proposal was audacious: form small, highly mobile units that could operate deep behind enemy lines using the desert itself as concealment. Not raiding parties that struck and withdrew quickly, but long-range reconnaissance patrols that could remain in enemy territory for weeks, gathering intelligence, attacking supply lines, and forcing the enemy to divert troops to protect their rear areas. The concept violated every principle of conventional military operations. No supply lines, no communications, no support. Just small groups of men in unarmoured trucks, hundreds of miles from friendly forces, entirely dependent on their own resources and skills. Wavell, who had his own unconventional streak, gave Bagnold 6 weeks and minimal resources to prove the concept. What Bagnold created in those 6 weeks became the template for special forces operations worldwide. The Long-Range Desert Group, initially called the Long-Range Patrol Unit, began with 76 officers and men, mostly New Zealanders from the 2nd New Zealand Division. The choice of New Zealanders was deliberate. Bagnold wanted men accustomed to self-reliance, comfortable with isolation, capable of independent thought. Farmers and sheep station workers who could navigate by the stars, repair machinery with improvised tools, and make decisions without orders. The vehicles were 30-hundredweight Chevrolet trucks, civilian models modified for desert warfare. Each patrol typically consisted of 2 officers and about 30 men in 10 or 11 trucks, though smaller patrols were common. The modifications were extensive: extra radiators, condensers to reclaim water vapour, multiple spare tyres, typically 8 per vehicle, steel sand channels, 4 per truck, each 6 feet long and weighing 25 pounds, sun compasses mounted on the hood, calibrated for the latitude. The armament was impressive for such small units. Each truck carried a heavy machine gun, either a Vickers K-gas-operated machine gun with a 950 round per minute rate of fire, or a Browning M250 caliber. Some trucks mounted twin Vickers K guns. Additionally, each truck carried at least 1 Boys anti-tank rifle, several Bren light machine guns, Thompson submachine guns, and a generous supply of hand grenades and explosives. But the real secret was the navigation equipment. Each patrol included at least 2 men trained in astronomical navigation, theodolites for star fixes, prismatic compasses as backup, and detailed logs recording course, speed, and time. Navigation was so precise that patrols could return to specific points in featureless desert after travelling hundreds of miles in between, finding landmarks the size of a single oil drum in an area the size of France. The supply calculations were meticulous. Each man required 1 gallon of water per day in the extreme heat. Fuel consumption averaged about 10 miles per gallon in the desert. Food was simple: bully beef, hard biscuits, tea, tinned vegetables, and the occasional luxury of tinned fruit. Each patrol carried enough supplies for 3 weeks minimum, with built-in reserves. The weight was staggering. A fully loaded patrol truck weighed nearly 3 tons, about double its rated capacity. The springs were replaced with heavier units. The engines were meticulously maintained. Tyre pressure was dropped to as low as 10 pounds per square inch in soft sand, compared to the normal 40 pounds, distributing weight and preventing the trucks from bogging down. The first operation, designated Operation Compass Reconnaissance, launched in September 1940. Captain Patrick Clayton, a pre-war surveyor who knew the desert as well as Bagnold, led a patrol deep into Libya to scout Italian positions and supply routes. The patrol travelled over 800 miles in 2 weeks, reaching points 150 miles behind Italian lines. They catalogued enemy positions, counted vehicles, identified headquarters locations, and returned without being detected. The intelligence was gold. British commanders suddenly had detailed information about enemy dispositions in areas Italian intelligence believed were secure. More importantly, the patrol proved that small units could survive and operate in the deep desert for extended periods. The success led to expansion. By December 1940, the Long-Range Desert Group had grown to 4 patrols. Each was designated by letter: G Patrol, Guards, T Patrol, New Zealanders, R Patrol, Rhodesians, and Y Patrol, Yeomanry. Each patrol developed its own character and specialties, but all shared the same basic mission: reconnaissance and raiding deep behind enemy lines. The impact on German operations began in early 1941 with the arrival of the Afrika Korps. Rommel's forces were professional, experienced, and equipped with excellent intelligence about British dispositions along the coast. But they had absolutely no intelligence about what was happening in their rear areas because they didn't believe anything could be happening there. The desert was considered impassable. German logistics, like Italian logistics before them, relied on predictable routes through supposedly secure rear areas. Supply convoys travelled with minimal protection. Airfields were positioned without defence in depth. Headquarters units operated in the open. All of this was based on the reasonable assumption that the nearest enemy was hundreds of miles away across impassable terrain. Captain David Lloyd Owen, who joined the LRDG in 1941 and eventually commanded it, later described the German attitude. They couldn't conceive that anyone would attempt to operate in the deep desert. Their maps showed it as empty, and they believed the maps. When our patrols first began appearing behind their lines, their immediate assumption was that we were lost. Several times, German units actually tried to help us, thinking we were their own troops who had taken a wrong turn. By the time they realised their mistake, we'd already left. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. Suddenly, German commanders had to consider that their rear areas might not be secure. Supply convoys began requiring escorts. Airfields needed guards. Headquarters had to post sentries watching empty desert. Troops and resources were diverted from the front lines to protect against an enemy that might be anywhere or nowhere. The LRDG's most effective weapon wasn't their machine guns, though those were formidable. It was uncertainty. A patrol might be watching from 40 miles away with binoculars, too distant to see but close enough to count vehicles and identify unit markings. Or they might be 5 miles away, ready to strike at dusk. Or there might be no patrol at all for hundreds of miles. The Germans had no way to know. The first major LRDG raid that truly terrified German command occurred on March 4, 1941, at Merzuk, an Italian fort deep in southern Libya, over 500 miles from the nearest British forces. The raid was led by Major Pat Clayton with G Patrol, 76 men in 23 trucks who had travelled 11 days across terrain Italian maps declared impossible to cross. The fort at Merzuk was a symbol of Italian colonial power, garrisoned by roughly 300 troops who considered themselves completely secure. The nearest reported British forces were 500 miles north, across the most brutal desert in North Africa. No attack was considered possible. Clayton's patrol approached the fort at dawn, having travelled the final 30 miles during the night. The attack was swift and devastating. Machine guns raked the garrison buildings. The airfield was destroyed, 3 Italian aircraft burning on the ground. The ammunition dump exploded in a fireball visible for miles. The entire action lasted 45 minutes. Then the patrol vanished back into the desert, leaving behind 20 Italian dead, dozens wounded, and complete chaos. The psychological impact exceeded the material damage. If Merzuk could be hit, nowhere was safe. Italian commanders began demanding German reinforcements to protect rear areas. Rommel, already frustrated by supply issues, now had to divert resources to guard against an enemy that appeared from nowhere and vanished back into wasteland. But the true revelation came when German intelligence finally captured LRDG documents after overrunning a forward base in April 1941. The maps horrified them. Detailed charts showing routes through terrain German experts had declared impassable. Precise coordinates for water sources that didn't appear on Italian maps. Navigation techniques allowing accurate positioning within miles after travelling hundreds of miles without landmarks. Most disturbing were the detailed logs of German positions, supply routes, and unit movements, all gathered by patrols that had operated undetected for weeks at a time. Oberst Friedrich Wilhelm von Mellenthin, Rommel's intelligence chief, later wrote in his memoirs. The long-range desert group caused us more trouble than any other British unit of equal size. They were experts at desert navigation, which allowed them to appear in unexpected places. We could never be certain our rear areas were secure. They turned our own desert into an enemy. Every supply truck needed escorts. Every airfield needed guards. All because small groups of madmen were driving around the Sahara like it was Hyde Park. The LRDG's operational pattern was methodical. Patrols would depart from their base at Siwa Oasis, an isolated location 350 miles south of the Mediterranean coast, deep in Egyptian territory. From Siwa they would travel west and south into Libya, often covering 500 miles or more before reaching their operational areas. The journey alone took a week or more. Once in enemy territory, the patrol would establish a lying-up position, typically in broken ground or among dunes that provided concealment. During daylight, the trucks would be camouflaged with netting, and the patrol would remain hidden, with observers posted on high ground with binoculars and telescopes. The trucks would be dispersed, never clustered, so that aerial reconnaissance wouldn't spot them. At night, the patrol would move, either to new observation positions or to attack targets of opportunity. Navigation was by dead reckoning and star fixes. The sun compass, a simple device using the sun's shadow, allowed accurate course-keeping during the day. At night, star. Fixes with the theodolite provided position updates accurate to within a few miles. The skill required was extraordinary. Navigator sergeants could calculate their position within 3 miles after travelling 300 miles across featureless terrain, an accuracy that astounded even experienced desert travellers. Lieutenant Colonel David Sterling, founder of the Special Air Service, who often worked with the LRDG, described their capabilities. The LRDG could travel 1,000 miles, hit a target the size of a football pitch, and return to base without ever being spotted. Their navigation was better than most ships at sea. I once saw them arrive at a rendezvous in the middle of the desert, having travelled 400 miles within 15 minutes of the appointed time and within a quarter mile of the appointed spot. In the Sahara, that's magic. The raids followed a pattern: swift approach, typically at dusk or dawn when visibility was poor and defenders drowsy. Overwhelming firepower, the massed machine guns could destroy soft targets in seconds. Immediate withdrawal before defenders could organise response. The LRDG rarely stayed to fight. Their goal was disruption, not occupation. Hit hard, vanish fast, force the enemy to waste resources protecting against the next attack. One of the most successful raids occurred in December 1941, when Captain Jake Easonsmith led T-Patrol against the airfield at Ajdabiya, a major Luftwaffe base supporting Rommel's advance. The patrol had travelled 600 miles from Siwa, taking 10 days to reach the target area. They spent 2 days observing the airfield from 15 miles away, counting aircraft, noting patrol patterns, identifying fuel dumps. The attack came at 0300 hours, 3 trucks racing onto the airfield while the rest provided covering fire from the perimeter. Time bombs were placed on 37 aircraft, Stukas, and Messerschmitt fighters. Fuel drums were machine gunned until they leaked, then ignited. The ammunition dump was blown with demolition charges. The entire raid lasted 22 minutes. By the time German gunners organised return fire, the patrol was already miles away, racing into the darkness with only compass bearings and dead reckoning for navigation. The explosions continued for hours as the time bombs detonated. Of the 37 aircraft on the field, 37 were destroyed or damaged beyond immediate repair. The fuel dump burned for 3 days. German commanders were apoplectic. The airfield was 90 miles behind the front lines, supposedly secure. Yet a British patrol had struck with impunity and vanished. Oberst Wolfgang Schreier, the Luftwaffe base commander, was court-martialed for incompetence, though he had done nothing wrong. The real failure was the High Command's assumption that rear areas were secure. The Germans responded by increasing security everywhere. Airfields that had operated with minimal guard now required full infantry companies for protection. Supply convoys that had moved freely now travelled in large groups with fighter, escort. Headquarters units that had been positioned for convenience now had to consider defensive positions. The LRDG, numbering never more than 350 men total, was tying down thousands of German troops in purely defensive roles. But it was the intelligence gathering that proved most valuable. While the raids garnered attention, the LRDG's primary mission was reconnaissance. Patrols would spend weeks in enemy territory, watching, counting, reporting via radio when possible, or bringing back detailed logs when radio silence was mandatory. The information was extraordinary, precise vehicle counts allowing British intelligence to identify unit movements, supply convoy tracking that revealed German logistics patterns, airfield reconnaissance showing aircraft types and numbers, radar station locations, coastal defences, water sources. Every detail was logged, mapped and reported. Major General Sir John Hackett, who served as an intelligence officer in North Africa, later stated the LRDG provided 80% of our intelligence about enemy movements in the deep desert. They were our eyes and ears. Without them, we would have been fighting blind. The LRDG also pioneered the technique of taxi service for other special forces. The Special Air Service, formed by David Sterling in 1941, quickly discovered that parachuting into the desert was problematic. Navigation was nearly impossible without specialised training. Supply was difficult. Extraction was uncertain. The solution was to have the LRDG transport SAS raiding parties to their targets, wait at a rendezvous point, then extract them after the raid. This became standard practice. The LRDG would navigate to within a few miles of the target, the SAS would raid on foot, then both units would vanish back into the desert together. The most famous of these combined operations occurred in December 1941, when the LRDG transported SAS parties to raid 5 German airfields simultaneously. The raids destroyed or damaged 90 aircraft in a single night, one of the most successful Special Forces operations of the war. But it was the LRDG's navigation that made it possible. Without their ability to find specific points in trackless desert, the raids couldn't have been coordinated. The human cost of LRDG operations was significant. Operating hundreds of miles behind enemy lines with no support meant that casualties couldn't be evacuated. Medical care was what the patrol medic could provide with limited supplies. Serious wounds often meant death, not from the wound itself, but from infection, dehydration, or inability to travel. Capture was always a risk. The Germans, initially confused about what to do with captured LRDG personnel, eventually classified them as illegal combatants because they operated in unmarked vehicles without clear identification. This classification was later revoked, but it meant that captured LRDG troops faced uncertain treatment. Despite this, or perhaps because of it, the LRDG maintained exceptional morale. The men were volunteers who understood the risks. They operated with a degree of independence unknown in conventional units. Officers and enlisted men shared the same hardships, ate the same food, faced the same dangers. The desert was the great equalizer. Captain Nick Wilder, who commanded our patrol, described the unique character of the unit. There was no saluting in the desert, no parade ground discipline, but the discipline that mattered, the discipline of navigation, vehicle maintenance, water discipline was absolute. A man who wasted water endangered everyone. A navigator who made mistakes could kill the entire patrol. Everyone understood this. The bonds forged in LRDG patrols were extraordinary. As Rommel's forces advanced and retreated across North Africa in 1941 and 1942, the LRDG adapted. When British forces retreated, LRDG patrols would remain behind, hidden in the desert, reporting on German movements. When British forces advanced, LRDG patrols would range ahead, scouting routes and enemy positions. They became the eyes of 8th Army, seeing what aircraft couldn't and going where conventional reconnaissance feared. The navigation challenges were immense. The Libyan desert lacks landmarks. For hundreds of miles, the terrain is either flat gravel plain or rolling dunes. No trees, no buildings, no rivers, no mountains. Navigation by landmark is impossible. The sun compass was the primary tool during daylight, a simple device consisting of a small vertical rod whose shadow indicated direction based on the sun's position and the time of day. Each compass was calibrated for the specific latitude. As the patrol travelled north or south, the compass required recalibration. At night, star fixes with the theodolite provided precise position. The navigator would select a bright star, measure its angle above the horizon, note the exact time, then calculate the patrol's latitude. A second star provided longitude. The calculations were done by hand using tables. The accuracy was remarkable, typically within 2 to 3 miles after travelling 200 miles. But navigation wasn't just about knowing where you were, it was about route selection. Experienced navigators learned to read the desert. Hard gravel plains allowed faster travel but offered no concealment. Sand dunes were slow but provided cover. Rocky areas could destroy tyres but sometimes contained wadis, dry riverbeds, that offered both concealment and easier travel. Fuel consumption varied dramatically with terrain. Soft sand might reduce range by 50%. Hard-packed surfaces allowed economical cruising. The navigator had to balance speed, concealment, fuel consumption, and tyre wear while maintaining accurate position. Water discipline was absolute. Each man's ration was 1 gallon per day, used for drinking, cooking, and minimal washing. In temperatures exceeding 130 degrees, this was barely adequate. The water was carried in 4-gallon tin cans, called flimsies because they would leak if roughly handled. Each truck carried approximately 40 gallons, enough for 4 men for 10 days. The temptation to drink more was constant. Dehydration was the ever-present threat. Men learned to conserve by drinking only at prescribed times, never when thirsty. Thirst, the old hand said, is just your body suggesting you drink. It's not telling you that you need to. You can ignore suggestions. The food was monotonous but adequate. Bully beef, tinned corned beef, was the staple protein. Hard biscuits replaced bread. Tinned vegetables, typically peas or carrots, provided some nutrition. Tea was sacred, brewed strong and sweet. The ritual of brewing tea, even under fire, was never skipped. It was a link to normality, a reminder that civilization still existed. Cooking was done on petrol fires, small amounts of sand soaked in gasoline and ignited. The flames were nearly invisible in daylight, producing no smoke. At night, cooking was done in covered areas to prevent light from being seen. Hot meals were limited. Often, men would eat cold bully beef and biscuits, rather than risk the time required for cooking. The maintenance demands were constant. Vehicles operating under extreme conditions required daily attention. Engines were checked every morning and evening. Oil was changed every 1,000 miles. Air filters were cleaned daily, often multiple times if travelling in dusty conditions. Tyres were inspected constantly, patched when damaged, replaced when necessary. Each patrol carried extensive spare parts and tools. Men became expert mechanics by necessity. A breakdown hundreds of miles from base wasn't an inconvenience. It was potentially fatal. Vehicles were often cannibalized to keep others running. 2 or 3 trucks might be abandoned after parts were stripped to repair others. The camouflage techniques were sophisticated. During daylight, patrols would hide in wadis, among rock outcrops, or in sand dune valleys. The trucks would be dispersed, never in a neat line. Camouflage nets would be erected, breaking up the vehicle's outlines. Reflective surfaces, windshields, mirrors, even brass shell casings would be covered. Movement was minimized. Men would remain in or near their vehicles, limiting foot traffic that could create patterns visible from the air. Observation posts would be established on high ground, but observers would be positioned to avoid silhouetting against the sky. German aerial reconnaissance was extensive. Fiesler Storch spotter planes could see for miles. The LRDG learned to recognize the distinctive sound of aircraft engines, remaining absolutely still when planes approached. The stillness was instinctive. Even with excellent camouflage, movement would attract attention. Patrols developed sixth senses about when they had been spotted. Aircraft circling back for another pass was a bad sign. Aircraft waggling wings was worse. It meant they were signaling ground units. When compromise was suspected, the patrol would immediately relocate, often travelling 50 miles or more before establishing a new hide. The winter of 1941-1942 brought new challenges. Rain, rare in the Libyan desert, could turn hard-packed surfaces into impassable mud. Cold desert nights dropped temperatures below freezing. Men who had complained about heat now shivered in thin blankets. The desert's extreme temperature swings, from 130 degrees in summer afternoon shade to near freezing at night, meant that equipment had to function across a 150-degree temperature range. Weapons maintenance was critical. Sand was the constant enemy. It infiltrated every mechanism, causing jams and malfunctions. Weapons were cleaned obsessively, often multiple times daily. The Vickers K machine guns were relatively sand-resistant, but still required constant attention. The boys' anti-tank rifles, powerful but temperamental, were particularly susceptible to sand jamming. Each patrol included at least one armourer whose full-time job was weapons maintenance. The ammunition load was substantial. Each Vickers K gun had 2,000 to 3,000 rounds in 100-round pan magazines. The Browning 50 caliber guns carried 1,000 rounds in belt form. Each man carried 200 rounds for his personal weapon, plus several grenades. Explosive charges for demolition work added more weight. The total ammunition weight per truck exceeded 500 pounds. In combat, the LRDG's tactic was to avoid close engagement. Their goal was to strike fast and withdraw before the enemy could respond effectively. The massed firepower of multiple machine guns could devastate soft targets in seconds, but the unarmoured trucks were vulnerable to return fire. A single well-placed burst could disable a truck or kill the crew. The doctrine was simple: strike first, strike hard, never stay to slug it out. If the enemy organised effective return fire, withdraw immediately. There would always be other targets, other opportunities. Survival depended on never being caught in a fair fight. The most dangerous moments were often the withdrawal. After a raid, German forces would respond with every available resource. Aircraft would search, ground units would pursue, radio direction finding would try to locate the patrol's transmissions. The LRDG's survival depended on navigation, knowing exactly where they were and where they needed to go, even while under fire and in the dark. Lieutenant David Lloyd Owen described a withdrawal after a raid in January 1942. "We left the target area with half the Afrika Korps chasing us, or so it seemed. Aircraft overhead, dust clouds behind us marking pursuing vehicles, radio chatter indicating they were vectoring forces to cut us off. But we knew where we were within 3 miles. They didn't know where we were at all. We navigated into broken ground they couldn't follow into, dispersed, waited until dark, then continued. By morning, we were 60 miles away, and they were still searching the area around the target. Navigation saved us. The German response to the LRDG evolved. Initially dismissive, considering them nuisances, German command gradually recognized them as a serious threat. Rommel personally ordered increased rear area security. Dedicated anti-patrol units were formed, German and Italian forces equipped with trucks and trained to operate in the desert. The Sahara Staffel units were specifically tasked with hunting LRDG patrols. The cat-and-mouse game intensified. LRDG patrols would spot enemy anti-patrol units and avoid them, sometimes observing them for days to learn their patterns. The Germans tried laying ambushes at known water sources, but the LRDG had secret water caches and rarely used predictable sources. Mining tracks was attempted, but LRDG trucks spread out widely and rarely followed the same route twice. The Germans' greatest success against the LRDG came not through military action, but through capture of documents. In September 1942, a forward LRDG base at Kufra was temporarily overrun. German intelligence captured maps, logs, and navigation data. For the first time, they understood the full scope of LRDG operations. The response was immediate. All rear area security was increased. Supply convoys were heavily escorted. Airfields received permanent defense detachments. Even then, the Germans couldn't stop the LRDG. The desert was too vast, the possible targets too numerous. The LRDG simply adapted, choosing different targets, using different routes, maintaining their presence deep behind German lines. As the North African campaign evolved toward its climax in late 1942 and early 1943, the LRDG's role shifted. With Montgomery's 8th Army advancing after El Alamein, the need for deep reconnaissance decreased. Instead, the LRDG focused on harassment and interdiction, cutting Rommel's supply lines at every opportunity. The raids became more frequent and more daring. In November 1942, multiple LRDG patrols simultaneously attacked supply routes, airfields, and fuel dumps. The cumulative effect was significant. Rommel's forces, already struggling with supply shortages, faced a rear area that was actively hostile. Every supply truck that didn't reach the front, every aircraft destroyed on the ground, every headquarters forced to divert troops for security, weakened the Afrika Korps at the critical moment. The final LRDG operations in North Africa occurred in early 1943 as German and Italian forces retreated into Tunisia. The LRDG shifted to reconnaissance of the Mareth Line defences, crossing hundreds of miles of desert to probe German positions from unexpected directions. Their intelligence was crucial for planning Montgomery's flanking attack through supposedly impassable terrain. The technique the LRDG had pioneered, using the desert as a highway rather than a barrier, became the key to breaking the Mareth Line. On May 13, 1943, German and Italian forces in North Africa surrendered. The campaign was over. The LRDG had operated continuously for nearly 3 years, travelling over 2 million miles collectively, conducting hundreds of raids and reconnaissance missions. The final accounting was remarkable. The LRDG, never numbering more than 350 men, had tied down thousands of Axis troops in rear area security. They had destroyed over 400 vehicles, dozens of aircraft, and countless tons of supplies. More importantly, they had provided intelligence that shaped every major British operation in the desert. But the statistics don't capture the psychological impact. The LRDG had turned the desert itself into a weapon. German commanders could never be certain their rear areas were secure. Every empty horizon could conceal watching eyes and machine guns. The vast Sahara, which should have been a protective barrier, became a highway for British raiders. Oberst von Mellenthin, in his post-war memoirs, devoted an entire chapter to the LRDG's impact. They were the most professional soldiers I encountered in the desert. Not fanatics, not adventurers, but thoroughly professional military men who understood their mission and executed it with precision. They turned our greatest geographical advantage, the desert's vastness, into our greatest vulnerability. Every resource we devoted to protecting our rear areas was a resource unavailable at the front. They never numbered more than a few hundred men, but they had strategic impact far beyond their size. If I had to identify the most effective British unit in North Africa, pound for pound, it would be the Long-Range Desert Group. After North Africa, the LRDG continued operations in the Mediterranean theatre. They operated in the Aegean, in Italy, in the Balkans. But it was their desert work that established the template for modern Special Forces operations. Small, highly trained units, deep penetration into enemy territory, self-sufficiency for extended periods, precise navigation, strike fast, vanish faster. The lessons learned in the Libyan desert became doctrine. The modern Special Forces concept of economy of force, achieving strategic effects with minimal resources, was pioneered by the LRDG. The emphasis on navigation, intelligence gathering, and surgical strikes rather than frontal assault became standard practice. The principle that mobility and stealth could be more effective than armour and firepower was proved in the desert. At the Imperial War Museum in London, a preserved LRDG Chevrolet truck sits in the Desert Warfare exhibit. The vehicle is battered, sand-scarred, bristling with machine guns. A placard describes its specifications and service record. But the real story is told by the navigation equipment mounted in the cab, the sun compass on the hood, the theodolite in its case, the detailed maps marked with coordinates and routes, the logbook recording courses, speeds and positions with meticulous precision. These were the true weapons of the Long-Range Desert Group. Not the machine guns, impressive as those were, not the explosives or the firepower, but the ability to know exactly where they were in trackless wasteland, to navigate 500 miles and arrive within minutes of the planned time and within a quarter mile of the planned position, to appear from nowhere, strike, and vanish back into nowhere. Below the display is a quote from Hauptmann Klaus Weber, the logistics officer whose convoy was destroyed in May 1942. He survived the war and was interviewed by British military historians in 1954. His statement captures the transformation of German attitudes toward empty desert. We thought the desert was our friend, a vast barrier protecting our rear areas. We were wrong. The desert was neutral, it protected no one, and the British learned to use it as a weapon. Those trucks appearing from 500 miles away, striking without warning, vanishing without trace. They were ghosts. We called them Wüstengeister, desert spirits. They made us fear empty horizons. Every dust cloud could be them. Every night we wondered if they were watching. They were always watching. The Long-Range Desert Group pioneered warfare in the world's harshest environment. They proved that training, navigation, and determination could overcome seemingly impossible obstacles. They demonstrated that a few hundred men with the right skills and equipment could achieve strategic effects. German troops had dismissed the possibility of threat from the deep desert. By the time they learned otherwise, the LRDG had already been operating behind their lines for months, watching, waiting, striking from 500 miles of wasteland. The empty desert had spoken, and its voice was the thunder of machine guns from the darkness, fired by men who knew exactly where they were and exactly where they were going. The laughter had stopped. The fear had begun. The LRDG's operations evolved dramatically as 1943 progressed. With North Africa secured, the unit faced potential disbandment. After all, their raison d'etre had been the Libyan desert, and that war was over. But Lieutenant Colonel Guy Prendergast, who had taken command from Bagnold in 1941, argued passionately that the specialised skills developed in the desert could be applied elsewhere. The War Office agreed, and the LRDG was redeployed to the Mediterranean theatre, bringing their unique capabilities to entirely different terrain. The Greek islands became the new operational area. In August 1943, LRDG patrols began infiltrating the Dodecanese and Aegean islands, gathering intelligence on German garrisons. The techniques were the same: covert insertion, detailed observation, precise reporting, extraction before detection. But instead of navigating by sun compass across sand, they navigated by stars across water, landing from kikes, Greek fishing boats, on remote beaches. The mission on Stampaglia Island in September 1943 exemplified the LRDG's adaptability. A patrol of 12 men landed at night, established an observation post in the hills, and spent 3 weeks cataloguing German defensive positions. They counted bunkers, identified artillery pieces, mapped minefields, noted patrol patterns. When they were finally extracted, they brought back intelligence that allowed British planners to accurately assess the island's defences. The subsequent decision not to invade Stampalia, because the defences were stronger than expected, saved hundreds of Allied lives that would have been lost in a failed assault. But the adaptation wasn't seamless. The Mediterranean operations lacked the vast spaces of the desert. Escape routes were limited. Extraction depended on boats arriving at precise times and places. The margin for error was smaller. On Leros Island in November 1943, a patrol was trapped when German reinforcements arrived unexpectedly. After a running firefight, 8 LRDG men were captured. It was one of the unit's highest single-day losses of the war, yet they persisted. Through late 1943 and into 1944, LRDG patrols operated throughout the Aegean. They raided German garrisons on Rhodes, Kos and Crete. They rescued stranded Allied soldiers. They gathered beach reconnaissance for planned invasions. They guided Greek resistance fighters. The desert specialists became island warfare experts through sheer professionalism and adaptability. In Italy, the LRDG operated in the Apennine Mountains, terrain that couldn't have been more different from the Sahara. Instead of endless flat horizons, they faced vertical mountainsides and deep valleys. Instead of extreme heat, they endured winter cold and snow. Instead of navigating by distant landmarks, they picked routes through close terrain where visibility was measured in yards, not miles. Major Vladimir Peniakov, known as Popsky, who led his own small unit called Popsky's Private Army, in coordination with the LRDG, observed their work in Italy with admiration. The LRDG men brought desert habits to the mountains, the same meticulous attention to navigation, though now with maps and compasses rather than sun compasses and theodolites, the same careful observation, though now from mountainsides rather than dunes, the same discipline about noise, movement and concealment. They adapted their techniques but not their standards. That's why they remained effective. The Italian operations focused on reconnaissance behind German lines. As Allied forces pushed north in 1944, the LRDG would infiltrate ahead, identifying German positions, locating headquarters, finding supply routes. The intelligence they provided was current and accurate, unlike aerial reconnaissance, which might be days old by the time it reached field commanders. In the Balkans, the LRDG operated with Yugoslav partisans, providing training, coordination, and occasionally firepower. They taught partisan units the navigation techniques developed in the desert, adapted for mountain warfare. They organized supply drops. They coordinated Allied air support for partisan operations. The mission had evolved from raiding to advising, but the core skills remained relevant. Sergeant Reg Seekings, who had been with the LRDG since 1941, serving continuously from the desert through the Mediterranean campaigns, reflected on the evolution in a 1945 interview. The missions changed, but the principles didn't. Know where you are, know where the enemy is, report accurately, strike when you have advantage, withdraw before you lose it. Whether you're in sand dunes or mountains or islands, those principles work. The LRDG wasn't about the desert, it was about professionalism in difficult places. As the European War approached its end in early 1945, the LRDG received orders for redeployment to the Far East. The plan was to use their expertise in jungle operations against the Japanese. Training began for tropical warfare, a complete environmental shift once again. But the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki ended the Pacific War before the deployment occurred. On August 1, 1945, the Long Range Desert Group was officially disbanded. The unit that had pioneered long-range special operations, that had proved small, highly trained forces could achieve strategic impact, that had turned impossible terrain into an operational advantage, ceased to exist. The men returned to civilian life or transferred to other units. The vehicles were sold as surplus. The navigation equipment was archived. The detailed patrol logs and reports were classified and filed away. But the legacy endured. The Special Air Service, which had worked closely with the LRDG throughout the war, adopted many of their techniques. The emphasis on selection and training, the focus on small unit operations, the principle of economy of force. When the SAS was reformed in the 1950s, LRDG veterans were among those consulted for doctrine development. The modern Special Forces community traces direct lineage to the LRDG's innovations. The concept of inserting small teams deep into denied territory for extended periods, the emphasis on intelligence gathering over direct action, the requirement for self-sufficiency and expert navigation, the selection of personnel for psychological resilience and independent thinking. All of these originated or were refined by the Long-Range Desert Group. The navigation techniques pioneered by the LRDG remained relevant well into the GPS era. Military survival schools still taught sun compass construction and astronomical navigation as backup skills. The principle that technology can fail but fundamental skills endure was proved repeatedly in conflicts from Korea to Afghanistan. LRDG patrol logs from the 1940s were studied by American forces preparing for desert operations in Iraq. The navigation method still sounds 60 years later. The psychological impact of the LRDG's operations extended beyond the immediate tactical effects. They demonstrated that conventional military assumptions about terrain could be challenged. What experts declared impassable might simply be unexplored. What appeared to be barriers might be highways for those with proper skills and equipment. This lesson resonated through military thinking for decades. General Erwin Rommel, in papers captured after his death in 1944, had written extensively about the LRDG threat. One passage, found in his personal notes about the North African campaign, was particularly revealing. The British Desert Group represented a type of warfare for which we had no answer. They operated beyond our intelligence network. They struck targets we believed secure. They forced us to defend everywhere, which meant we defended nowhere effectively. In conventional terms, they were insignificant. In practical terms, they were perhaps the most troublesome enemy I faced in Africa. Not because of what they destroyed, but because of the uncertainty they created. Rommel's assessment captured the essential truth about the LRDG's impact. They were never going to win the North African campaign by themselves. Their raids, while damaging, weren't strategically decisive in isolation, but the cumulative effect of their operations, the forced diversion of resources, the intelligence provided, the constant uncertainty, contributed significantly to the Allied victory. Post-war analysis by military historians attempted to quantify the LRDG's value. Some focused on the direct effects: vehicles destroyed, supplies burned, aircraft eliminated. These numbers, while impressive for such a small unit, didn't capture the full picture. More sophisticated analyses looked at the indirect effects: German forces tied down in rear area security, supply convoys slowed by need for escorts, operational tempo reduced by security concerns. A 1952 study by the Royal United Services Institute concluded that the LRDG's operations in 1941 and 1942 forced the Germans to divert approximately 15,000 troops to rear area security duties who would otherwise have been available for frontline service. Given the narrow margins in several North African battles, those 15,000 troops might have changed outcomes. The study noted this was a conservative estimate, not accounting for the psychological effects or the intelligence value. The intelligence contribution was perhaps the most valuable legacy. LRDG patrols provided detailed current information about enemy dispositions, movements, and capabilities. This intelligence directly supported planning for major operations including Operation Crusader, the breakout from Tobruk, the Battle of Gazala, and the pursuit after El Alamein. In several cases, LRDG reports were the only reliable intelligence available about German positions in the deep desert. The human stories behind the statistics revealed the character of the unit. These weren't supermen or glory seekers. They were professionals, often quietly competent men who excelled at difficult tasks. Many were tradesmen in civilian life, mechanics, farmers, surveyors. They brought practical skills and common sense to military operations. The officer-enlisted relationship in the LRDG was notably different from conventional units, more collegial, based on mutual respect and shared hardship. Sergeant Jack Dennis, a New Zealand farmer who served in Tea Patrol from 1940 to 1943, exemplified the LRDG type. In civilian life, he had managed a remote sheep station, accustomed to self-reliance and isolation. In the desert, these qualities made him invaluable. He could repair vehicles with improvised tools, navigate by the stars, and remain calm under pressure. He was wounded twice, mentioned in dispatches 3 times, and never sought recognition. After the war, he returned to New Zealand and resumed farming, rarely speaking about his service. The medical challenges faced by LRDG personnel were significant and often overlooked in official accounts. Desert sores, infections caused by the combination of sand, sweat, and minor abrasions, affected nearly everyone. The sores could become seriously infected in the harsh conditions. Dysentery was common, debilitating in the extreme heat. Eye problems from constant sun exposure and sand plagued many men. Dehydration was an ever-present danger despite strict water discipline. The LRDG's medical officer, Captain Dick Lawson, developed innovative treatments for desert-specific ailments. He found that gentian violet, normally used for minor antiseptic purposes, was highly effective against desert sores when combined with strict hygiene protocols. He pioneered the use of electrolyte solutions for treating severe dehydration, mixing salt and sugar in precise ratios. His medical protocols became standard for all Commonwealth forces operating in the desert. Mental resilience was as important as physical endurance. The isolation of long patrols, sometimes 3 weeks without contact with friendly forces, tested men's psychological stability. The constant awareness that help was impossible if things went wrong, that serious injury likely meant death, created stress that not everyone could handle. The LRDG's selection process, informal but effective, identified men who could cope with this psychological burden. Lieutenant Colonel David Lloyd Owen, who commanded the LRDG from 1944 until its disbandment, reflected in his memoirs on what made the unit special. It wasn't that we were braver or tougher than other soldiers. Many units had brave, tough men. What distinguished the LRDG was the combination of technical skill, particularly navigation, with the psychological ability to operate independently in extreme conditions. You had to be able to navigate across 300 miles of featureless desert and arrive within a few miles of your target. You had to be able to spend 3 weeks behind enemy lines without support, making life or death decisions with no one to consult. You had to be able to function effectively despite heat, cold, thirst, fatigue, and constant danger. Not everyone could do all of that. The men who could were LRDG material. The unit's informal culture was deliberate. Bagnold and his successors understood that the type of operations they conducted required men who could think independently and exercise initiative. Rigid military discipline was counterproductive. What mattered was reliability, competence, and judgment. A private soldier might have to make decisions that would normally be made by officers. An NCO might command a patrol if officers were casualties. Everyone needed to understand the mission and be capable of executing it with minimal supervision. This culture occasionally created friction with conventional military units. LRDG personnel, accustomed to informality in the desert, sometimes failed to observe proper military courtesy when visiting rear areas. Their appearance, often scruffy after weeks in the field, didn't match parade ground standards. Their casual attitude toward rank and regulations shocked some traditional officers, but senior commanders who understood their value protected them from criticism. Montgomery himself intervened on several occasions to deflect complaints about LRDG irregularity. The equipment innovations pioneered by the LRDG influenced vehicle design for decades. The modifications made to standard trucks, lowered tire pressure, additional cooling, sun compasses, extended fuel capacity, became standard features for military vehicles operating in extreme environments. The condensers used to reclaim radiator water were adopted by civilian desert travelers. The sand channels, simple but effective, remained standard equipment for desert operations into the 21st century. The navigation instruments used by the LRDG are now museum pieces, made obsolete by satellite navigation, but the principles they embodied remain valid. Know your position precisely. Plan routes carefully. Navigate accurately. Verify position regularly. These principles apply whether using a theodolite and star tables or a GPS receiver. The technology changes, but the importance of knowing where you are never does. In the 1960s and 1970s, as the SAS and other Special Forces units expanded their roles, they frequently consulted LRDG veterans. The experience of operating independently in hostile territory for extended periods was directly relevant to Special Forces missions in Malaya, Borneo, Oman, and elsewhere. The techniques of covert observation, minimal signature movement, and precise reporting were refined in the Libyan desert and applied in jungles, mountains, and urban environments. Several LRDG veterans became influential figures in post-war military development. David Lloyd Owen became a senior officer in the British Army, eventually commanding forces in the Middle East. His experiences with the LRDG shaped his approach to military operations, emphasizing careful planning, thorough reconnaissance, and economy of force. Jake Easton Smith, the patrol commander who raided Ajdabiya, remained in military service and contributed to Special Forces doctrine development through the 1950s. The reunion dinners held by LRDG, veterans in later years were remarkable events. Men who had shared the most intense experiences of their lives would gather to reminisce, but the conversations often focused on mundane details rather than heroic actions. They discussed vehicle maintenance techniques, navigation problems solved, the taste of desert water from different sources. The extraordinary had become ordinary to them. What stood out in memory were the small moments of human connection in impossible circumstances. Captain Nick Wilder, speaking at a reunion in 1967, captured this perspective. People expect us to tell war stories, dramatic raids and narrow escapes. But what I remember most are the sunrises. After a night of navigation, arriving at your planned position just as the sun came up, and the navigator confirming you were exactly where you intended to be. That feeling of professional satisfaction was worth more than any medal. We were craftsmen. The desert was our workshop. We took pride in doing difficult work well. The German veterans who faced the LRDG developed a complex relationship with their former adversaries. Initially dismissive, then fearful, they ultimately developed respect that bordered on admiration. Post-war meetings between German and LRDG veterans were cordial, even warm. The shared experience of desert warfare created bonds that transcended former enmity. Fritz Bayerlein, who served as Rommel's chief of staff and encountered LRDG effects repeatedly, met David Lloyd Owen at a military history conference in 1956. Their conversation was recorded by a journalist present. Bayerlein told Lloyd Owen, "You made our lives miserable. Every morning we would receive reports of another raid, another supply convoy lost, another airfield hit. We never knew where you would strike next. Rommel would rage, demanding we stop you. But how? The desert was your friend, our enemy." Lloyd Owen's response was characteristically modest. "We were just doing our jobs. You made it difficult for us too. Your forces were professional and effective. We succeeded because we understood the terrain and used it properly. Any competent force could have done the same." Bayerlein shook his head. "No, not any force. You needed the right men, the right training, the right leadership. The LRDG had all three. That's why you succeeded where others would have failed." The archives of the Long Range Desert Group, now housed at the Imperial War Museum and the National Archives in Kew, filled dozens of boxes. Patrol logs, navigation charts, intelligence reports, photographs, equipment specifications, training manuals. Researchers studying special operations, desert warfare, or World War II history find the documents endlessly fascinating. The level of detail is extraordinary. Every mission meticulously documented, every decision explained, every position recorded to the nearest mile. But perhaps the most interesting documents are the personal diaries and letters that some men kept despite regulations. Against such records, these provide insight into the human experience behind the operational reports, the fears, the boredom, the camaraderie, the black humour that sustained men in impossible situations. The mundane details of daily life on patrol, the quality of the bully beef, the techniques for brewing tea in sandstorms, the methods for staying sane during long watches in observation posts. One letter, written by Trooper Michael Sadler in December 1941 and discovered in the archives decades later, captured the essence of LRDG life. "We've been behind German lines for 18 days. Everything I own is covered in sand. The food is terrible. The water tastes like metal. We sleep under trucks to escape the cold. Every day I think this is madness, we shouldn't be here. Then I look at the navigator confirming our position, exact as always. I see the discipline with which we operate. Everything checked. Nothing left to chance. I watch how we work together, each man competent, reliable, professional, and I realise this is what competence looks like. This is what professionalism achieves. We're doing the impossible, and we're doing it well. That's worth every hardship. The LRDG's influence on modern military thinking extends to unexpected areas. The emphasis on selection over training, identifying individuals with the right psychological makeup rather than trying to train unsuitable candidates, became standard for special forces worldwide. The concept that small, highly capable units could achieve strategic effects influenced force structure decisions. The recognition that specialist skills like navigation, languages, or technical expertise were as important as combat skills shaped personnel development. Business schools and leadership development programs have studied the LRDG as a case study in high-performance teams. The flat hierarchy, the emphasis on competence over rank, the culture of mutual trust and respect, the clear mission focus, all are recognised as characteristics of effective organisations. Books on leadership frequently cite the LRDG as an example of how to build and sustain excellence in challenging environments. The environmental legacy of the LRDG is surprisingly minimal. Unlike many military operations that leave lasting scars on landscape, the LRDG passed through the desert, leaving almost no trace. Their discipline about waste disposal, their careful movement to avoid creating tracks, their policy of carrying out everything they carried in, meant that LRDG patrol routes are virtually impossible to identify today. The desert has reclaimed any trace of their passage. This was deliberate. Bagnold understood that leaving evidence of their presence would compromise future operations. Patrol commanders were strict about policing campsites before departure. Shell casings were collected, refuse was buried or carried out. Even footprints around observation posts were swept away with brushwood. The LRDG operated on the principle that the best evidence of their presence was its absence. Modern desert travellers occasionally discover artefacts from the North African campaign: rusted vehicles, scattered equipment, unexploded ordnance. But items specifically attributable to the LRDG are rare. The unit's policy of maintaining and recovering equipment meant little was abandoned. What was left behind was usually damaged beyond use, and has since been scavenged or buried by shifting sands. The human cost of LRDG operations, while light compared to conventional infantry units, was still significant for such a small organisation. Approximately 200 men served in the LRDG at various times during the war. Of these, 30 were killed in action, 25 died in accidents, and 40 were seriously wounded. The casualty rate of roughly 35% over 4 years reflected the dangerous nature of the operations, but the statistics don't capture the individual tragedies. Captain Patrick Clayton, the pre-war surveyor who had explored the desert with Bagnold and led early LRDG patrols, was killed in a vehicle accident in 1944 in Italy. He survived hundreds of miles of desert operations only to die on a mountain road. Captain Nick Wilder, beloved by his men for his calm competence, was killed in action in the Aegean in 1943. Sergeant Bruce Ballantyne, one of the original New Zealand volunteers, died when his truck hit a mine in 1942. Each loss diminished the unit not just in numbers but in accumulated experience and expertise. Unlike conventional units where individual soldiers were more easily replaced, each LRDG casualty represented a significant loss of specialized knowledge and skills. The men who died had irreplaceable experience in desert navigation, vehicle maintenance, and long-range operations. The memorials to the LRDG are scattered and modest. A plaque in the crypt of St. Paul's Cathedral lists the dead. A small monument at Siwa Oasis marks the location of their main base. The regimental archives preserve their records, but the most fitting memorial is perhaps the continued existence and success of modern special forces units that employ the methods the LRDG pioneered. In 2015, on the 75th anniversary of the LRDG's formation, a commemorative event was held at the Special Forces Club in London. Veterans, now in their 90s, attended alongside representatives from modern special forces units. The speakers emphasised continuity, how the lessons learned in the Libyan desert remained relevant in Afghanistan, Iraq, and other contemporary operational environments. The techniques had evolved, the technology had advanced, but the fundamental principles endured. One of the last surviving LRDG veterans, Ron Hill, who joined in 1943 and served until disbandment, spoke briefly. He was asked what he wanted people to understand about the LRDG. His answer was simple and profound. We weren't heroes. We were professionals doing a difficult job. We succeeded because we prepared properly, trained hard, and never underestimated the challenge. The desert didn't care about courage. It cared about competence. That's what we brought. Competence, professionalism, and respect for the environment we operated in. Those qualities will always be relevant, no matter what century you're fighting in or what technology you're using. The long-range desert group existed for 5 years. It never numbered more than 350 men at any time. It conducted perhaps 200 major operations. By conventional measures, it was insignificant, a tiny unit in a global conflict involving millions of soldiers. Yet its impact was disproportionate to its size. It pioneered techniques that shaped modern warfare. It demonstrated that properly trained small units could achieve strategic effects. It proved that impossible terrain could become operational advantage with the right skills and equipment. German troops learned to fear empty desert horizons not because of what they could see, but because of what they couldn't. The knowledge that highly trained men might be watching from 40 miles away with binoculars, counting vehicles and noting movements. The awareness that tonight those same men might be 5 miles away with machine guns ready. The uncertainty that corroded confidence and forced the diversion of precious resources to protect against threats that might or might not be present. The empty desert had indeed struck from 500 miles away. And by the time German commanders understood the threat, by the time they recognized that the wasteland itself had become weaponized against them, the damage was already done, resources were committed, confidence was shaken. The rear areas that should have been secure became contested space, all because of men who understood that in warfare, as in so much else, expertise and determination could overcome apparently insurmountable obstacles. The thunder of machine guns from darkness, the crash of explosives destroying supplies, the rumble of heavily laden trucks vanishing back into wasteland. These became the sounds German troops learned to fear. The long-range desert group had spoken, and the desert would never be safe again.